Pay no attention to the person you might occasionally see behind me. They are, I believe, waiting for tomorrow's clinical skills training. I think it might be resuscitation. Anyway, because we are here to talk about, I understand that studying the muscles of the forearm is really difficult. Studying the anatomy of the upper limb and the forearm is really difficult. So I'm creating a smaller chunk, and we are just going to consider the movements of pronation and supination. We are going to look at the bones, look at the joints, look at the ligaments, talk about the movement and the muscles. There aren't very many, and their innervation, which will then lead us back to some of the clinical usefulness of this information. Okay? First of all then, the movement and the bones. The movement, the bones. My colleague Chris always likes to help people remember this by saying, if you're holding a bowl of soup, you are supinated. Supination, pronation, supination, pronation, supination, pronation. This movement is a movement of the forearm. This isn't moving, so my humerus isn't rotating. It's these bones here. Here's the humerus. Here's the thumb. This is where you'd feel the radial pulse. This is the radius then, laterally. This is the ulna. The ulna is wrapped around the humerus and is forming the hinge of the hinge joint. This is the bony bit that you can feel here. So because the ulna is wrapped around the humerus, the ulna cannot rotate. So the ulna itself cannot take part in pronation nor supination. So it's all radius. And what's happening is that the radius is spinning around, it's rotating around the ulna. That's the movement. So we're very interested in the radius, but we're also interested in all the other bits that it articulates with. So what joints do we have? Well, there is a joint between the radius and the humerus. There's a joint between the radius and the ulna at the proximal end, and there's a joint between the radius and the ulna at the distal end. And for fun, they're also linked all the way down here by an interosseous membrane. So these two bones are very well linked. So here's the humerus. So this is the humero-radial joint here. And the radius there, it has, so this is the head of the radius. This is the distal radius here. This is the head of the radius. The head of the radius is a circle. It's got a little indentation. So the humero-radial joint, these are all synovial joints, but can you see that spins around there? It's absolutely beautiful. It's a fascinating bit of anatomy. It's just this perfectly round thing. Not only does this circular head of the radius articulate with the humerus, but it also articulates with the ulna, and the ulna has a notch cut out of it for the radius. So the ulna up here has a radial notch, which means that the circle of the radial head curves within that notch. Now there is a ligament. So these are all synovial joints here, and they're kind of all in a shared synovial capsule reinforced by various ligaments. But in terms of supination and pronation, there's a ligament that runs from the ulna around the radius and back to the ulna, making a ring. An annulus is a ring. So this is the annular ligament holding the radius in place there and holding the head of the radius up there. And in between the radius and the ulna, there is a quadrate ligament. Quadrate meaning, you know, quadrangular, like rectangular, which might be considered a thickening of the annular ligament. But that quadrate ligament in there, again, tying these two bones together, the radius and the ulna, also limit how far you can pronate and supinate, because there's a hard lock, right? So some of that is because of the quadrate ligament in there limiting the movement. I'm afraid this model is from the other side, the right side, but I do often jump sides because it's good to get you guys thinking about right versus left and transposing this anatomy. For some people it's easy, for some people it's not. So here, this is right radius, right ulnar. So there's the hinge of the ulnar. This is the radius here. So with pronation, that movement happens, and there is the annular ligament holding the radius in place there. And I don't think we've got a quadrate ligament inside there, but it would be deep in there. And these are collateral ligaments of the elbow joint up here. But then we've also got a joint at this end in this model, and also in life. This is the distal radioulnar joint. Back to the left side. So, radius ulnar. And look how, as we get to the wrist, the radius becomes really, really wide. So it's the radius that's actually going to articulate with the carpal bones. The ulna is now very, very thin. This is the head of the ulna. And the radius actually has an ulnar notch to receive the ulna. This is a synovial joint at this end again, because we've got lots of lovely movement here. But there is a triangular fibrocartilaginous wedge in here forming all of these joints. That's part of this joint. And then the two bones here are tied together with palmar and dorsal radioulnar ligaments. So that's the distal radioulnar joint, right? And if you look at the joints between that and the wrist, you'll see more about that triangular fibrocartilaginous complex that's down here. But then also along the length, or most of the length here, there is an interosseous membrane, a sheet between the bones. That interosseous membrane runs in here between the ulna and the radius. And this is a joint between the two bones. It's sharing the forces between the two bones. It's tying them both together. But also when we pronate and supinate, the tension changes. So that interosseous membrane doesn't have. You can maybe get a sense of what's going on here. If there's a membrane between these two bones, and in fact you see these ridges. The shape of the bone, remember, is dictated by things that attach to it. So if there's a sheet of membrane in there, an interosseous membrane, when we pronate, that sheet is not under a great deal of tension. It's slack. And then when we supinate, that interosseous membrane comes under tension. And that will also limit how far we can supinate, right? This guy's got no ligaments. He's got screws and bolts and all sorts, but he can supinate farther than I can because those ligaments are not limiting the range of movement. Let me move to the right side. Okay, right arm, radius, ulnar. All right, we've looked at the bones, we've looked at the joints, we've looked at the movements. What do we have that can make these movements? Well, there are a few muscles. Pronator Teres is going to pronate the radius. Here's the humerus here. Here's the epicondyle. There's a bit of a ridge up here. So this is the medial epicondyle. The medial supracondylar ridge is up here. Oh, and the ulna has got this little sticky-outy bit. The coronoid process, like a beak, and when we flex the elbow, it goes into that little groove, that little depression, that little sulcus in there, which again gives a hard stop on how far you can flex your elbow. So Pronator Teres comes from this medial supracondylar ridge of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulnar, and that runs around kind of like that to to the radius. There is a tuberosity over here, but also it inserts into the shaft. So when that muscle shortens, it pulls the radius around the ulna. I have a model. Here's a model of the muscles of the arm. It's a great big arm. This is a right arm. And up here is Pronator Teres. So there's that medial epicondyle of the humerus. You can palpate your own. It runs, so actually the Pronator Teres muscle then is crossing the elbow. So if it felt so inclined, it could get involved in elbow flexion. But look at the angle that it's running at. It's running around here to the radius over there. So this is a good pronator of the forearm. It is innervated by the median nerve. There's the median nerve there. Because the Pronator Teres muscle is covering the median nerve, and maybe these things are in a tighter spacing closer together than you might realise, pathology of the Pronator Teres muscle could compress the median nerve, cause problems with the median nerve from this point onwards. The median nerve is like innervates the powerful finger flexors and the muscles of the base of the thumb and that sort of thing. Now, distally down here, we have another muscle called Pronator Quadratus. It's on this side, so it's anterior. It runs between the radius and the ulna, but it's wrapping around those bones. It's attached to those bones, right? Which means it's deep to all of these muscles. And I can't take all of these off, so it's the deepest layer of muscles. And Pronator Quadratus means that it's a good pronator, but it also means that it's a rectangular shape, like that rectangular ligament we were talking about earlier. So Pronator Quadratus is a very deep muscle just before the wrist, just proximal to the wrist. And it is also innervated by the median nerve. So those two muscles work together to pull the radius about the ulna and give pronation. I once did a lot of that pronation action when tiling a bathroom, when doing the grouting, and you're constantly pronating as you're pushing the grout into the gaps between the tiles. That gave me soreness here. It made Pronator Quadratus really, really sore. So I had soreness just proximal to the wrist, and it really stood out where that muscle was. So go spend a day tiling a bathroom and see if you can better understand your Pronator Quadratus muscle. The other muscle that often gets linked, or sometimes gets linked to pronation, is this guy here, Brachioradialis. Now, Brachioradialis it's a muscle of the posterior compartment of the forearm. And again, we've got the lateral epicondyle of the humerus here. And this is coming from the lateral supracondylar ridge. It's coming from the humerus, right? The lateral supracondylar ridge. And it's running to the radius. And this gets called the beer drinker's muscle because it's quite a good elbow flexor, but it's best at flexing the elbow when partly pronated, supinated, pronated. So if you go from supination to pronation, then this is like a useful flexor of the elbow. So when you're drinking beer, it's the beer drinker's muscle. It's good at flexing the elbow. It doesn't cross the wrist, just crosses the elbow joint there, but that means that it can assist in pronation because it can pull the radius from this position to this position. But your mileage may vary. You may read different things in different places, but brachioradialis. Brachioradialis is innervated by the radial nerve because it's in the posterior compartment. But that's pronation. So we're pronated now. What about supination? What have we got that pulls the radius back again? Well, my favourite is probably this one here, but there's another little one. There's a little supinator muscle called supinator because that's what it does. It supinates. Supinator, tricky, this one. So supinator is in the posterior elbow. This is the humerus. This is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Your lumpy bit out here, right? And supinator comes from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It comes from that annular ligament that we talked about. It comes from the ulna, and it wraps around like the proximal third of the radius. So it wraps around the posterior, the lateral, and the anterior surfaces of the radius. But I don't know about you, you look at that and it doesn't really make sense with how's that going to supinate? Well, of course, what we have to do is we have to move into pronation. And now when you consider how that muscle is wrapped around the radius, now you can see how as that muscle contracts, it will supinate. So out here it doesn't make a lot of sense because we're already supinated. But when pronated, that muscle is now able to contract and pull the radius around. So that's supinator. We can see it on the model, kinda. I am going to take off Brachioradialis because, again, this is a muscle that's wrapping around the radius, so it's going to be deep, right? So we can see a bit of the radius bone there, a little bit. So that muscle there, this muscle here that's covering the radius and is running up to the elbow, and can you see how the fibers are kind of running in that direction around there? That's the supinator muscle. It's a muscle of the posterior elbow, so it's innervated by the radial nerve. But biceps brachii, this muscle of the arm of the brachium, has two heads that come from the scapula, so it crosses the shoulder joint and it crosses the elbow joint, and it inserts into the radius. It inserts into the radial tuberosity, and it also inserts into the antebrachial fascia, the fascia of the forearm. So the radius has this radial tuberosity that the biceps inserts into. The biceps can be quite a large muscle. So that suggests that if you pronate and you supinate, well, that attachment site of biceps is moving around. So biceps could, once pronated, if biceps was to contract, it could pull the radius back around. So the biceps is a powerful supinator. And you can see this on yourself, right? The biceps muscle, it moves as we pronate and supinate. So the biceps muscle is attached to the radius, and as I pronate, my radius is going around, so the muscle gets longer to allow the pronation, and then I can contract my biceps muscle to pull the radius around and supinate. So biceps brachii is a powerful supinator when the elbow is flexed. So when you're screwing a screw into the wall, you're using biceps to generate that power. When the elbow is extended, it's not a great supinator. It's still doing its thing, but it's not as powerful. So with the flexed elbow, biceps brachii is a powerful supinator. Biceps brachii is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. So, pronation, supination. There are two good pronators, Pronator Teres, Pronator Quadratus, that help with pronation, pulling the radius around the ulna. There is the supinator muscle, which can then supinate and pull the radius back around, and also biceps brachii is a good supinator. Brachioradialis is most effective when partially pronated, so might get involved in pronation if it feels like it. But I talked about the innervation, didn't I? So those two pronator muscles were innervated by the median nerve. Biceps is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. Supinator is innervated by the radial nerve. So if somebody has an injury, for example to the brachial plexus, the upper trunk of the brachial plexus, like Erb's palsy, or an injury to one of these nerves, so if they damage the median nerve, not only will they have weakness of pronation, but because all these muscles have different tensions and they oppose one another, the supinators will have more tone, so they're likely to be in a supinated position and find it difficult to pronate. Now, in Erb's palsy, when the upper brachial plexus is injured and the musculocutaneous nerve is damaged, then the biceps brachii muscle cannot resist the tone of Pronator Teres and Pronator Quadratus, so that person tends to be in a pronated position and they struggle to supinate, because sure, if the radial nerve is still functioning, the supinator muscle will supinate, but they've lost the power of biceps brachii. That's why I mentioned the nerves. Also, nerves are cool. Nerves are good. It's good to know. In the forearm, it's complicated. The elbow, it's complicated. There are 4 muscles to focus on. So if you think about their innervation as well, it just helps you so much with the function and things that can go wrong, and you can work stuff out. Anyway, there we go. Pronation, supination, joints, ligaments, muscles, nerves. See you next week.